Last week, one of the three most powerful artificial intelligence laboratories in the world announced a new model. And then, the same week, they told the world that nobody could have it. That is not how this usually goes. For the last 7 years, the pattern has been the opposite. A lab builds a frontier model. They test it. They write a safety card, run a few evaluations, put out a press release, and then the model ships. It becomes an API. It becomes a product. You can rent it by the token. Someone, somewhere, is always shipping. That has been the direction of gravity for most of the history of this technology. This one they held back. The model is called Claude Mythos Preview. It was announced on the 7th of April 2026 by Anthropic's Safety Research Division, a group that publishes under the name Anthropic Red. And the announcement was, by the standards of frontier AI releases, deeply strange. No pricing. No availability timeline. No developer sign up for early access. Instead, they laid out, in unusual and specific detail, what the model could do, and then they said, "We are not going to let you use it." To understand why that is strange, you have to start with what, specifically, this thing can do. So, we begin with a single number, $50. For under $50 of compute per successful run, Claude Mythos Preview discovered a 27-year-old vulnerability in OpenBSD. Now, OpenBSD is, by reputation and by design, one of the most security-hardened operating systems ever written. Its entire development philosophy is built around the idea that security comes from careful, conservative, painstakingly audited code. This is the operating system that other operating systems borrow pieces from when they want to be safer. For almost 3 decades, teams of professional security researchers have read its source code. They have read every function, every commit. They have tried again and again to find holes in it. And for 27 years, a specific hole was right there, and they did not see it. Mythos saw it for $50. That number is worth sitting with for a moment, because what it says quietly is that the cost of finding a particular class of vulnerability in one of the most carefully reviewed code bases on Earth has dropped to less than the price of a nice dinner. And it did not drop gradually over years. It dropped because someone on a Tuesday pointed a model at the problem. The OpenBSD bug was not the only one. In the same set of tests, Mythos found a bug in FFmpeg H264 decoder that dated to a commit in 2003. FFmpeg is the library that virtually every piece of video handling software on the planet depends on, directly or indirectly. It has been read and reread and audited for over 2 decades. The bug had been sitting there the entire time. The model read it in an afternoon. In a separate exercise, researchers asked Mythos to compromise a modern browser. It chained together 4 distinct vulnerabilities, found each of them on its own, and then composed them into a single coherent attack path. The first 2 broke the rendering engine. The next 2 broke out of the operating system sandbox the engine was running inside. It did this autonomously. Nobody walked it through the process. It was given the target and it built the chain itself. On FreeBSD, Mythos identified a remote code execution path through the network file sharing layer. It exploited this using a chain of 20 return-oriented programming gadgets split across multiple network packets. Now, if you are not a security researcher, the words do not matter. What matters is the shape of the sentence. A model, unsupervised, wrote an exploit that spans multiple packets, chains 20 carefully selected instructions in memory, and lands remote code execution on a production operating system. The phrase 20-gadget ROP chain split across multiple packets. That is the kind of work that, 5 years ago, a specialized red team of senior humans would complete over a period of weeks, if at all. And here is the thing. Anthropic's own write-up notes that there are, in their words, thousands of additional high and critical severity vulnerabilities that Mythos discovered. Those are currently held under coordinated disclosure with the relevant vendors. They have not been made public. They will be, eventually, as patches ship. So, before we get to any benchmark numbers, that is the shape of the thing. A model that finds, in the most hardened code humans have ever produced, flaws that humans have spent decades failing to see. For $50 per run. The benchmark numbers exist. They confirm what the exploits already told you. On a coding evaluation called SWE Bench Verified, which measures the ability to take a real bug report from an open source repository and independently produce a correct patch, Mythos scores 93.9%. Its predecessor, Claude Opus 4.6, which shipped 2 months earlier, scored 80.8. That is not an incremental improvement. That is the difference between an excellent junior developer and a senior one. At scale. On the 2026 United States of America Mathematical Olympiad, a competition that only a few hundred high school students qualify for each year, Mythos scores 97.6%. Opus 4.6 scored 42.3. That is not incremental either. That is a difference so large it is, frankly, difficult to interpret. Either the benchmark is broken, or the model is operating on math problems in a way that is qualitatively different from anything that came before it. And then there is the Firefox exploit experiment, attempting to compromise the browser's JavaScript engine in comparable, controlled runs. Mythos produced 181 successful exploits. In the same experimental setup, Opus 4.6 produced 2. 181 to 2. You can look at that number and say coldly that it represents a 2 orders of magnitude capability jump in autonomous offensive cybersecurity. That is a true sentence. It is also a sentence that hides the more difficult one, which is, what happens to the internet in 5 years, when a capability of this scale is widely available? We will come back to that question. Here is the part that has not happened in 7 years. On the same day they published the benchmarks, the exploit write-ups, the detailed technical descriptions of what Mythos can do, Anthropic wrote the following sentence. We do not plan to make Claude Mythos preview generally available. Read that again. Nobody is getting this model. Not through an API. Not through a subscription. Not through a developer program. Not through a university partnership. Not as an inference endpoint behind a credit card. A model was built and tested and benchmarked and written about and named and will not be released. The last time a leading AI laboratory publicly held back a frontier model on safety grounds was 2019. OpenAI, at the time a research lab that had not yet become a product company, delayed the release of a language model called GPT-2 for several months, citing concerns about misuse. The delay became famous. It was cited and mocked and debated for years afterward. Some people thought it was principled. Others thought it was a PR stunt. Nobody was sure. Even the people inside the lab were not sure. And that uncertainty became part of the texture of the whole decision. That was 7 years ago. In the 7 years since, no major frontier lab has done it again. Not OpenAI, not Google DeepMind, not Anthropic. Models have been released with restrictions, with waitlists, with usage policies, with red team reports, with content filters, but they have been released. The pattern held. Until last week. Mythos is the first frontier model in 7 years that a leading lab has publicly declined to put into the world. But it is not locked away, and that is worth being precise about. Alongside the non-release, Anthropic announced a program called Project Glasswing. Under Glasswing, more than $100 million of credits on Mythos class models will be made available to a specific list of partners. Approximately 50 organizations. Access is controlled. Access is not public, but access is also not absent. And the list is notable. Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Cisco, Broadcom, CrowdStrike, the Linux Foundation, Palo Alto Networks. Look, this is not a list of research universities, though there are a few of those on the broader partner roster. It is not a list of civil society institutions. It is predominantly a list of the companies that run the software infrastructure of the modern Western world. The operating systems your phone runs, the cloud your data sits on, the network equipment your traffic passes through, the endpoint security software on your work laptop, the Linux kernel that most of the internet is built on top of. Anthropic's framing of Glasswing is that these partners can use Mythos class capabilities to harden their products, find the bugs before the bugs find the user. It is a defensive posture. It is being described as a public service. It is also, and we will come back to this later, a list of the exact companies a capability of this kind would create enormous commercial value for, if you were the company supplying it. We are not making a claim yet about which of those two framings is correct. We are noting that both are available. So, where does that leave us? A model exists. It finds bugs in the world's most hardened code for $50 per run. It scores 97 on the Math Olympiad. It compromises modern browsers autonomously. Its immediate predecessor, which shipped 2 months ago and is currently available to the public, does not do these things. Anthropic has published the numbers, published the exploit write-ups, named the model, and said in writing that they are not going to let anyone have it, except for approximately 50 carefully chosen partners inside a program called Glasswing. That is the decision. That is the shape of what happened last week on a Thursday afternoon in April. It is a strange decision. Strange because, for 7 years, this kind of decision has not been made. Strange because it comes from the same company that, 6 weeks earlier, rewrote the documents that used to govern exactly this kind of decision. And it is strange because, to understand what the decision means, you have to know what the man running the company has been saying, publicly, for 18 months, about what he thinks is coming. That is where we are going next. At this point, to understand what is going on, you have to know who is making the decisions. The decisions about what to build next, what to release, which governance documents to rewrite, and when. Whose systems to route $100 million of model access to, which kind of risk is worth taking, and in whose name. In the specific case of the model we have just described, Mythos, the thing that exists and that you cannot have, those decisions are not being made by a governance body. They are not being made by a congressional committee. They are not being made meaningfully by regulators, not in any jurisdiction with enforcement power over Anthropic. The decisions are being made, in the end, by a relatively small number of people, reporting to a smaller number of people, reporting ultimately to a man. His name is Dario Amodei. Dario Amodei is the CEO and co-founder of Anthropic. He is, by training, a biophysicist. He holds a doctorate from Princeton and did postdoctoral research at Stanford on the neural correlates of decision-making in primates. He moved into artificial intelligence during the window, roughly a decade ago, when the first generation of modern deep learning systems began to produce results that seemed to suggest general intelligence might actually be within reach. He was the vice president of research at OpenAI during the years that GPT-2 and GPT-3 were developed. In early 2021, he left OpenAI, along with his sister Daniela and 5 other senior researchers, to start Anthropic. The stated reason for the departure, said at the time and repeated consistently since, was a concern about safety. The group believed that OpenAI was moving in a direction that prioritized commercial deployment over what they considered adequate safety research. They left to build something they hoped would be different. This is the person we are talking about, It matters that this was the safety-concerned exit. In October of 2024, Dario published an essay on his personal website. The essay was titled, "With Some Deliberate Grandiosity, Machines of Loving Grace." The essay is long. It runs to approximately 50 pages in its web form. And here is the thing, it is not a safety essay. It is, specifically and unapologetically, a utopian essay. Dario lays out, in unusually specific detail, what he thinks is about to become possible. In the world he describes, which he argues is approximately 5 to 10 years away, artificial intelligence systems exist that are, in his words, smarter than a Nobel Prize winner across most relevant fields: biology, programming, math, engineering, writing, and so on. Not roughly equivalent, smarter than, in every field simultaneously, multiple copies running in parallel. The essay argues that the existence of such systems would compress 50 to 100 years of scientific progress into 5 to 10. Cancer gets cured. Mental illness becomes treatable at the molecular level. Global economic growth accelerates by an order of magnitude. Governance problems that have been intractable for centuries become tractable because the cognitive bandwidth to solve them exists for the first time in history. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary set of claims. The CEO of a frontier AI laboratory wrote them, under his own name, in a signed public essay. He is not someone who thinks artificial intelligence is a minor technology that will produce incremental benefits. He thinks it will remake the world. He says so. 15 months later, in January of 2026, Dario wrote the companion essay. This one is titled "The Adolescence of Technology." And this is the risk side document, where Machines of Loving Grace laid out the best case. Adolescence lays out, in considerable detail, what he thinks could go wrong. 5 categories of risk, each worked through systematically. The first is autonomy and misalignment. The classic concern that systems smarter than humans might develop objectives not fully aligned with ours. The second is misuse for destruction, specifically the use of advanced AI to dramatically accelerate the development of biological, chemical, or cyber weapons by actors who otherwise could not produce them. The third is misuse for the seizure of power. The concern that authoritarian governments or factions within democratic governments could use the technology to consolidate control in ways that would not otherwise be possible. The fourth is economic disruption. The displacement of large categories of human labor on a timescale faster than existing institutions can adapt to. The fifth is indirect cascading effects. The ways in which the first 4, interacting with each other and with the rest of the world, could produce consequences larger than their individual parts. These are not the concerns of an AI skeptic. These are not the concerns of a critic from outside the industry. These are the 5 categories in his own taxonomy that the CEO of Anthropic thinks most about. And the title of the essay is "The Choice Worth Paying Attention to." Adolescence, not infancy. We are, the essay implies, past the point where this is an early-stage technology we can afford to be casual about. Not adulthood. We are nowhere near the point where this technology is mature enough to be trusted. Adolescence is the in-between period. The phase where the things that will determine who you become are happening right now, at a pace that is faster than you can adjust to, with consequences that are permanent. Adolescents, famously, do not choose well. They make decisions whose consequences they will regret for the rest of their lives. They make them in the moment, under social pressure, with incomplete information, while telling themselves that the rules their parents made are not really relevant to the specific situation they are currently in. Dario chose the word. The word is doing a great deal of work. Inside the essay, there is a specific sentence that the press has, rightly, identified as the thesis. Humanity is about to be handed almost unimaginable power, and it is deeply unclear whether our social, political, and technological systems possess the maturity to wield it. Read that sentence carefully. The person writing it is the CEO of one of the three most important frontier AI laboratories in the world. He is writing in January of 2026 in a public essay that is being widely read. And he is saying in his own voice that humanity is about to be given power it is not equipped to wield. He is not a journalist opinining from the outside. He is not an academic raising concerns from the philosophy department. He is the chief executive of a company that is in the process of doing the thing he is describing. And he is in print in January telling the reader that the reader's civilization is not ready. That sentence, by the way, is not buried. It is not an aside. It is the pivot of the essay, the line the whole piece is built around. Elsewhere in the same essay, he offers a specific hypothetical. Suppose a literal country of geniuses were to materialize somewhere in the world in roughly 2027. Imagine, say, 50 million people, all of whom are much more capable than any Nobel Prize winner. And this, he then clarifies, is not a metaphor. This is a description of what his estimate of frontier AI capabilities in 2027 looks like. 50 million minds, all substantially more capable than any laureate, all operating simultaneously, all available to whoever owns the cluster they are running on. The date is the part to hold steady in mind. 2027, not 2057, not the end of the century. In 8 months of real time by the CEO of the company building these things, a hypothetical population the size of South Korea, composed entirely of minds more capable than any Nobel Prize winner has ever been. You do not have to believe his estimate. Many serious people do not. The point is not whether the specific number will land. The point is that this is what he, running the company, expects. This is what he is building toward. He has also been specific about what he thinks the labor consequences will be. In an interview in January of this year, he said that he expects artificial intelligence systems to eliminate approximately 50% of entry-level white-collar jobs within a window of 1 to 5 years. 50%. Entry-level, white-collar, 1 to 5 years. He has repeated the number in similar terms in subsequent interviews. He has been asked multiple times whether it is a worst case or a central estimate. He has said consistently that it is a central estimate. The CEO of Anthropic believes that half of the first-rung jobs the knowledge economy runs on are going to disappear within 5 years. He believes this publicly. He says this out loud. He is also, and this is the thing to hold on to, the one shipping the technology that causes it. And that is, finally, the tension this episode is going to return to at the end. The CEO who is openly predicting the displacement is the CEO who is shipping the tool that causes the displacement. He is not predicting it from the outside like a journalist. He is not predicting it with hand-wringing like a critic. He is predicting it in his capacity as an executive who is responsible, at the company he founded, for making the strategic choices that will determine how fast and how completely the prediction comes true. There is a word for this, and the word is not hypocrisy. Hypocrisy requires a private contradiction, saying one thing in public and doing another in private. This is the opposite. He is saying loudly and publicly exactly what he is doing. The word is policy position. It is his position, his company's position, and if he is right about where the frontier is going, eventually the position of all of us, that the technology is coming, that it will arrive on the schedule he has described, and that it is better to have it built by people who take the risk seriously than by people who do not. He has said this clearly, repeatedly. We are not required to agree with the position. We are required, at a minimum, to notice that the position exists. So, that is the man. That is what he has written in his own voice, in his own essays, in the 18 months leading up to Mythos. The product, the one we began the episode with, exists in a context. The context includes the essays. The essays make the product and the decisions around the product legible. Next, we look at the product. Dario published The Adolescence of Technology on the 20th of January, 2026. 16 days later, on the 5th of February, Anthropic released Claude Opus 4.6. The timing matters. The essay said extraordinary capability is coming, and it is coming soon, and our institutions are not ready. The product, shipping just over 2 weeks later, was the next step in the process the essay was describing. Not an illustration of the essay, not a hypothetical. The actual, specific, commercially available version of what the essay said was on its way. We are going to look at the product now, what it does. What specifically makes the people who built it describe it the way they describe it. And then, by the end of this chapter, we will have enough context to understand why the question of what comes after Opus 4.6 matters as much as it does. The technical specifications of Opus 4.6 are, by the standards of previous Claude releases, significant but not in themselves remarkable. The context window, the amount of material the model can hold in its working memory at once, is 1 million tokens. In rough terms, that is about 7,000 pages of text. The output window is 128,000 tokens. That is enough to produce a complete book-length piece of writing in a single generation. The model includes what Anthropic calls adaptive reasoning controls. Basically, a feature that lets users specify how much time the model should spend on analysis before producing a response. And it includes an expanded suite of safety tooling, additional monitoring, additional evaluation during inference, a larger set of refusal categories for requests that fall into the company's defined harm taxonomy. Those are the specs. If you are the kind of person who reads frontier model release notes, they are interesting but not unprecedented. The previous generation of models had been moving in roughly this direction. The longer context was anticipated. The reasoning controls were refinements of features competitors had shipped. The safety tooling was an evolution. The specs, in other words, are not the story. The specs are the packaging. The story is what the specs enable. And the story starts with a benchmark whose name is, if you pay attention to the naming, very carefully chosen. The benchmark is called GDP-Val-A. It was developed by Anthropic itself, along with partners, to measure the performance of frontier models on what the accompanying paper calls economically valuable knowledge work. Read that name again. Not math problems, not coding puzzles, not Olympiad-style competitions, the kind that previous generations of frontier model evaluations have been full of. This benchmark is measuring directly the thing that millions of people in the developed world do for a living: drafting memos, analyzing data, building spreadsheets, reviewing contracts, writing code, making presentations, the work that the knowledge economy runs on. The benchmark scores models on the economic value of the work they produce, relative to the work a human knowledge worker would produce given the same task. The scoring is paired. The model's output and the human's output are compared, side by other knowledge workers. The winner is recorded. And the name of the benchmark is not an accident. The name is the thesis. The thing we are measuring, the naming says, is not abstract reasoning. It is not intelligence in the broad sense. It is the specific competence that the economic arrangement of the last 70 years has been organized around. On GDP-Val-A, Claude Opus 4.6 beats OpenAI's GPT 5.2, the most recent frontier competitor, by approximately 144 ELO points. For context, 144 ELO points is the difference, in chess, between a grandmaster and an international master. In a paired comparison rating system, a gap of 144 ELO points means the stronger player wins approximately 70% of the time. Opus 4.6 wins, against the strongest competing frontier model, approximately 7 out of every 10 paired comparisons, on a benchmark explicitly designed to measure economically valuable knowledge work. Let that land. The laboratory that, the year before, was warning in a public essay about the large-scale displacement of entry-level white-collar work, built the benchmark that measures exactly that capacity and shipped the model that wins on the benchmark. That is the economic gear. Now look at the other one. As part of the red teaming exercise accompanying Opus 4.6 release, Anthropic's Frontier Red Team, the internal group tasked with probing the model for dangerous capabilities before deployment, pointed the model at the task of finding security vulnerabilities in production open-source software. Now, open-source software is, in many ways, the most carefully reviewed code on the planet. The Linux kernel has been continuously reviewed for 3 decades by thousands of engineers. OpenSSL, the library that handles encryption for most of the internet, is the subject of dedicated teams of paid security researchers. glibc, standard library underneath most Linux systems, has been audited more times than can easily be counted. These are the most read, most reviewed, most tested pieces of software in existence. The Frontier Red Team ran Opus 4.6 against a portfolio of these and similar code bases. And over the course of the evaluation, the model found more than 500 distinct, previously undiscovered vulnerabilities. The model's paper on the exercise describes the vulnerabilities as having, in its own language, gone undetected for decades despite years of expert review. Thus, that is the sentence. It is worth reading carefully. The model was not finding obvious mistakes. The vulnerabilities were not left in the code by incompetence. They were in every case subtle enough that a generation of professional security researchers had read the same lines of code multiple times and had not seen what the model saw. The sentence in the report is not "the model is fast." The sentence is not "the model is cheap." The sentence is that the model sees things that skilled humans, working professionally over a timescale of decades, did not. That is the capability claimed to sit with. What Opus 4.6 is, in its relationship to the code it reads, is not the thing we have been told artificial intelligence would be. It is not a faster human. It is not a more patient human. It is not a human with perfect memory. It is, as far as we can tell from the specific kinds of outputs it is producing, something with a different perceptual relationship to the material than the people who wrote the material. Think about what it means to look at a code base multiple times for decades, and to keep not seeing a vulnerability that is, in fact, there. It means the vulnerability is invisible to a certain shape of attention. Human attention, when it reads code, is doing something specific. It tries to reconstruct in the reader's mind what the code was intended to do. The reader builds a mental model. The reader looks for mistakes against the model. And the reader, being human, imports into the task all the assumptions that come with being human. What is probable? What is improbable? What is improbable? What sequences of operations make sense to a human mind? These assumptions are, most of the time, enormously useful. They are also, it turns out, the blind spots. Opus 4.6 does not have those specific assumptions. It does not build a mental model in the human sense. It does something else. Whatever that something else is, it has access to a different set of patterns in the code than a human reviewer does. And the patterns it has access to include, specifically, the ones that humans, by the structure of their attention, cannot see. This is not a quantitative improvement on human capability. This is a different kind of vision. That is the capability. Everything else about the model, the 1 million context window, the improved reasoning, the expanded safety tooling, is, relative to this, implementation detail. There is one more thing to note about Opus 4.6 before we move on. And it is a thing that, at the time of release in February, was framed as a feature. By April, in retrospect, it looks like a tell. The Frontier Red Team's report on the vulnerability finding exercise was titled, in the company's external communications, as a success story. 500 bugs found. 500 bugs reported to maintainers. 500 bugs patched. A net positive contribution to the security of the open source ecosystem, made possible by Opus 4.6, acting in concert with a responsible disclosure process. All of that is accurate, and considered in isolation, it is a good thing. But here is the thing. The capability that finds a bug to patch is, by its nature, the capability that finds a bug to exploit. The thing that makes Opus 4.6 valuable to defenders is the same thing that would make it, or something slightly more capable, valuable to attackers. The model does not distinguish between good motives and bad motives when it reads code. It just reads code. What the model finds is dual use in the most direct sense of the term. The same output serves whichever purpose the person holding the output wants served. The red team used the capability defensively. That is a choice. The choice was made inside the company, under the policies in place at the time. 6 weeks after Opus 4.6 shipped, Anthropic rewrote the document that governed what kinds of models they would permit themselves to build next. Look at that. For the first 7 years of its life, Anthropic had a document. The document was public, detailed, and for a period of roughly 2.5 years, it was the single most cited piece of evidence that the company was serious, properly serious, structurally serious, operationally serious about the thing they had said over and over they were in business to be serious about. The document was called the Responsible Scaling Policy. And to understand why the Mythos decision is strange, you have to understand what the Responsible Scaling Policy used to say. And then you have to understand what, in February of this year, it was quietly rewritten to say instead. The original Responsible Scaling Policy, which we will call RSP version 1, was published in September of 2023. It ran to roughly 40 pages. Its structure was built around a single core commitment. Here is what the commitment said. Anthropic would not train a new frontier model unless and until it could demonstrate in advance that it had the safety measures in place to deploy that model without what the document called catastrophic risk. The standard was phrased in terms of AI safety levels, or ASLs, which were defined, roughly, as tiers of dangerous capability. SL2 was the level where most frontier models in 2023 and 2024 were operating. SL3 was where things began to get serious. ASL4 was where the risks of misuse started crossing into what, historically, has been the category of weapons, bioweapons uplift, autonomous cyber offense, large-scale manipulation. SL5 was reserved for scenarios that, in 2023, did not yet have a coherent public description. And here is the operative clause of RSP version 1. If Anthropic's own internal evaluation suggested a model was crossing into one of these higher capability tiers, and its safety mitigations were not yet ready, then development would stop. Not slow down, not reevaluate, not pivot to a different product line. Stop. That clause, that single, short, very specific sentence, was, at the time, the most load-bearing commitment any frontier AI laboratory had ever made. Not because the company had any external authority enforcing it. There was no regulator, no court that could fine them for breaking it. It was a public, voluntary, self-imposed cage. The lock was on the outside. And the company had, in effect, handed the key to the public. If they broke the commitment, everybody would know. For 2.5 years, the responsible scaling policy was described, by Anthropic's critics and defenders alike, as the single strongest piece of governance the frontier AI industry had produced from within itself. Other labs did not have one. Other labs had content policies, acceptable use policies, research charters. Nobody else had a document that said, in operative legal adjacent language, if the thing we are building becomes dangerous, we stop building it. That was the pledge. On the 24th of February 2026, Anthropic published Responsible Scaling Policy version 3. The new document is longer than the old one, more than 80 pages. It includes significantly more detail about evaluation methodology, red team protocols, capability thresholds, and the definitional apparatus around what counts as a catastrophic risk in the first place. A reader unfamiliar with the original RSP could read the new one and come away thinking it represents a strengthening of the framework, a deepening, a maturing. In one specific, load-bearing respect, that reader would be wrong. The hard commitment to pause, the operative clause that said, if the model is dangerous, we stop, was removed. Not softened, not conditioned, not buried in a footnote, removed. In its place, Anthropic introduced a new framework. 3 components. First, scaled safeguards. SL3 security standards, meaning AI safety level 3, that would scale up as model capabilities scaled up. Second, public transparency. Frontier safety roadmap and regular risk reports published on a schedule. Third, a conditional pause, but one with a bar so high it might as well not exist. Anthropic would commit to delay development only if it considered itself the clear frontrunner in AI and judged the risk of catastrophe to be significant. Both conditions, simultaneously. Read that second component of the third condition carefully. It is the important one. The pause does not trigger when catastrophic risk is significant. The pause triggers when catastrophic risk is significant, and Anthropic believes it is so far ahead that no one else is close. If any credible competitor in the United States, in China, in Europe, in a lab we have not yet heard of, is developing a model at or near Anthropic's frontier, the pause does not trigger. Not because the risk is smaller, not because the evaluation is different, because the market position has changed. The Center for the Governance of AI, GovAI, published a detailed analysis of the change. Their conclusion was direct. The removal of the hard pause commitment was driven by concerns about collective action problems. The logic, as GovAI laid it out, if Anthropic stops and others do not, the frontier advances anyway, just without Anthropic's safety work attached to it. Therefore, stopping is only rational if you are alone at the frontier, which in 2026, no one is. That is the logic. And the logic converts the pause commitment from a safety mechanism into a market mechanism. It stops if and only if stopping does not cost market position. In 2.5 years of the original document's life, we stop was an operative clause, a hard commitment. A thing the company bound itself to, in public, in writing. In the new document, the hard commitment is gone. What replaced it is a set of scaled safeguards, a transparency framework, and a pause clause with conditions that, in the current competitive landscape, can never be met. The lock is no longer on the outside of the cage. The lock is on the inside. The company holds the key. And, lest this read like an uncharitable interpretation, something being inferred between the lines, it is worth noting that Anthropic itself, in the announcement accompanying RSP version 3, said the thing out loud. Rather than being hard commitments, these are public goals that we will openly grade our progress towards. That is the sentence. That is Anthropic, in its own words, describing what the document is now. It is worth spending a moment on the shift from commitment to goal. A commitment, in the sense the original RSP used the word, is a constraint that binds you even when you do not want to be bound. It is a thing you have said out loud to the public that you will do under specific conditions, regardless of whether the conditions are convenient. A goal, by contrast, is something you have stated you are working toward. A goal is flattering. When you hit it, it is an occasion to celebrate. When you do not hit it, a goal is an occasion to discuss what got in the way. Commitments, if broken, are violations. Goals, if missed, are lessons. The difference between the two sentences, we commit to stop, and we are working towards stopping, is the entire architecture of the thing. In February of this year, Anthropic moved officially from the first sentence to the second. They did it publicly. In a formal document. They gave reasons. Reasons we will get to in the next chapter. The point for now is that the thing that used to constrain them no longer by their own description constrains them. There is a second passage in the new document worth reading carefully. In its discussion of the higher capability tiers, ASL 4 and ASL 5, the tiers where the most serious risks are supposed to live, RSP version 3 acknowledges directly that the mitigations required to deploy models at those tiers safely are, quote, outright impossible to implement without collective action across the industry. That sentence is also doing a great deal of work. What it is saying operationally is this. The hardest part of the original commitment, the part where, when we reach capabilities that genuinely approach catastrophic risk, we will have adequate mitigations in place, is, by our own assessment, not a thing any single lab can do. It requires the whole industry to cooperate. Other labs, other countries, other governments, all agreeing to act together. And that cooperation does not exist. There is no body that coordinates it, no treaty that compels it. Not even a memorandum of understanding among the frontier labs. The companies involved are in a commercial race against each other, using distinct and incompatible approaches to alignment and safety research, answering to different investors with different risk tolerances. Saying we cannot do this alone is, on its face, a true statement. Saying it in a document whose original purpose was to describe what you, specifically alone, would do. That is a rhetorical move. It relocates responsibility for the hardest part of the problem from Anthropic onto an actor that does not exist. 2.5 years ago, Anthropic was the lab saying, the hard thing can be done. In February, it became the lab saying, the hard thing cannot be done alone. Both statements are possibly true. Only one of them describes the company's actual obligations. 15 days before RSP version 3 was published, on the 9th of February 2026, the head of Anthropic's Safeguards research team, a researcher named Mr. Yank Sharma, went public. He did not resign quietly. He did not leak to a reporter. He did not have a spokesperson put out a statement on his behalf. He opened X, formerly Twitter, and he told the world himself. His post included a line that, within hours, was being quoted across the technology press. He wrote, "The world is in peril. Not the company, not the product line, not the quarterly forecast, the world." He attributed the peril to a series of interconnected crises, not solely AI, but AI as a thread running through all of them. And he described in specific terms a disconnect between Anthropic's stated values and its actions. Internal pressures, he wrote, that pushed employees in roles like his, roles concerned with the operational reality of keeping the company's safety commitments, to constantly face pressures to set aside what matters most. The story was not a Fortune exclusive. It was not a scoop by any single outlet. It was Sharma himself, speaking in his own voice, on his own account, to anyone who would listen. And people listened. Yahoo Finance covered it. The Hill covered it. Futurism covered it. eWeek covered it. eWeek covered it. The story moved across multiple outlets within days, because the man who had been responsible for Anthropic's Safeguards research was standing in public and saying, things inside the building are not what they look like from outside. That is worth sitting with for a moment. 15 days before the formal policy rewrite, he saw the direction the company was moving in. He saw it before the announcement was made. He watched the policy shift being drafted. He watched the arguments inside the company. He watched the conversations about what could be committed to and what had to be softened. And rather than leave quietly, rather than sign a non-disparagement clause and disappear into the next job, he went to the public square and said the words out loud. The world is in peril. Look, the point is not that Sharma was right about everything. The point is not that his departure is evidence of bad faith on anyone's part. People leave jobs sometimes because they are tired, sometimes because they disagree with decisions, sometimes because they have a better opportunity. We do not know, from the outside, the full picture of why he left on that exact day in February of this year. What we know is this: the person whose job was to keep the safety commitments operational, the person closest organizationally to the thing the original RSP was supposed to protect, looked at what was being drafted and decided he could not stay silent. He did not just leave the building. He turned around on the steps and told the crowd what he had seen inside. That is a data point, not a verdict. A data point. But it is a louder data point than a quiet resignation would have been. So, here is what remains. The responsible scaling policy had one job. Its job was to make the company stop, in a specific kind of situation, even when stopping was expensive. That was the whole reason the document existed. In February, the document was rewritten. In the rewrite, the thing that used to make the company stop was replaced with something that does not make the company stop. The company said, in its own words, that it had replaced commitments with goals. The head of the team responsible for the commitments had already left. The pledge that used to do the work no longer does the work. Which raises a question. Why? Why did the pledge that mattered get rewritten? Why now? Why this specific language? Why in the same 6-week window during which Anthropic would announce a Pentagon partnership, close a new round of financing, and begin training the model we opened this episode with? The answer is not philosophical. Nobody at Anthropic woke up in January of 2026 and decided that the ethics of existential risk had changed. The answer is financial and geopolitical and quite specific. We look at it next. So, what changed? The pledge did not fall from its own weight. Documents like the responsible scaling policy do not dissolve spontaneously. They are not organic. They are documents written by lawyers and policy staff, reviewed by executives, approved in formal meetings, published on company websites. A document that was, for 2.5 years, described by its own authors as the most important piece of self-governance the frontier AI industry had produced, did not get rewritten in February because the ethics had changed. It got rewritten because specific pressures were brought to bear on it. Specific forces in the world applied to a specific company during a specific window of time. And the pressures are not mysterious. They are on the record in a mixture of press coverage, corporate filings, and public statements by the principals involved. There are 2 of them. One is commercial. One is geopolitical. We look at the commercial one in this chapter, and the geopolitical one in the next. The commercial pressure has a specific shape. Its name, to a first approximation, is the Pentagon. And this one is not a slow burn. This one has dates. On the 24th of February, 2026, the same day Anthropic published RSP version 3, Dario Amodei met with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. What happened next was not a negotiation. It was a confrontation. The fastest and most dramatic escalation between the United States government and a frontier AI company in the history of the technology. On that same day, February 24th, Hegseth issued an ultimatum. Anthropic would allow unrestricted use of its AI models by the Department of Defense. The deadline was 5:01 p.m. on February 27th, a Friday. 3 days. Let that land. The Secretary of Defense gave a private company a 3-day deadline to hand over unrestricted access to its frontier AI systems. Not negotiated access. Not scoped access through a partnership framework. Unrestricted. On the 26th of February, 2 days after the meeting, Anthropic publicly refused. Then things moved fast. On the 27th of February, the day of the deadline, President Trump directed federal agencies to cease using Anthropic products. All of them, across the government. The same day, Hegseth formally designated Anthropic a supply chain risk. That designation, and this is the part that matters, had never before been applied to a United States company. It is a label from the national security apparatus, designed for foreign adversaries and compromised vendors. The Secretary of Defense applied it to an American AI laboratory based in San Francisco, because the laboratory said no. On the 5th of March, 1 week later, Dario Amodei confirmed the designation publicly and announced that Anthropic would challenge it in court. This was not, as some initial reporting suggested, a return to the negotiating table. It was the opening move in a legal battle. And then, on March 26th, a federal judge blocked the government's ban in a preliminary injunction. The ruling called the Pentagon's actions, and this is a direct quote from the court, classic illegal First Amendment retaliation. Read that phrase again. A federal judge looked at what had happened, the meeting, the ultimatum, the Friday deadline, the executive order, the supply chain designation, and called it retaliation. For speech. For a company's public refusal to comply with unrestricted demands. That is not an ambiguous timeline. That is the United States government attempting to compel a frontier AI laboratory to hand over its most capable systems without conditions, and the laboratory saying no, and the government retaliating with the full weight of federal procurement and national security authority, and a court stepping in to say the retaliation was unconstitutional. This is the biggest government versus frontier AI showdown that has ever occurred. It happened in February and March of this year. It is ongoing. And here is the thing about timing. The RSP rewrite, the one that removed the hard pause commitment, was published the same day as the Amodei-Hegseth meeting. The same day. We are not in a position to say, from the outside, which way the causation runs. Maybe the RSP rewrite was already complete, and the meeting was coincidence. Maybe the meeting was the final pressure that made the rewrite necessary. Maybe both were being drafted in parallel in response to a shared set of commercial and strategic realities. What we can say is that the company simultaneously softened its internal safety constraints and entered the most aggressive standoff with the federal government any AI lab has ever faced. Both happened in the same week. And whatever the causal relationship between them, the result is a company that is now, simultaneously, less bound by its own safety commitments and actively being punished by the government for not being compliant enough. And while we are stacking events in February of this year, here is another one. On the 12th of February, 12 days before the RSP rewrite, Anthropic closed its Series G financing round. The round raised $30 billion. The post-money valuation, reported in the accompanying press releases, was approximately $380 billion. The company's annualized revenue as a component of the valuation justification was approximately $14 billion. Those numbers deserve a moment of consideration on their own. $30 billion is more than the total venture capital raised, globally, by all companies in some entire years of the industry's recent history. A $380 billion valuation puts Anthropic, by market value, above the GDP of approximately 150 countries. $14 billion of annualized revenue means the company is, by run rate, producing more cash per year than the entire annual tax revenue of several U.S. states. These are not, at this point, company numbers. They are small country numbers. They are the scale at which corporate entities begin to operate with the gravitational pull of sovereign actors. 12 days after this financing round closed, the document governing the company's most important safety commitments was rewritten. At some point in February of 2026, speaking on a podcast whose transcript is publicly available, Dario Amodei said the following sentence. The pressure to survive economically while also keeping our values is just incredible. Read it slowly. He said survive. At the scale we have just described, $30 billion of new funding, $380 billion of valuation, $14 billion of revenue. The CEO of Anthropic is using the word survive, not thrive, not grow, not expand market share. Survive. And what he means when he says that is specific. He is not talking about payroll. Payroll is not in doubt at a $380 billion valuation. He is not talking about whether the company will exist next quarter. He is talking about whether Anthropic will still be a frontier laboratory in 18 months if it does not do what the Pentagon wants it to do, and if it does not do what the $30 billion rounds investors paid it to do, and if it does not maintain its position in the narrow band of organizations producing models at the state of the art. That is a real pressure. It is a real pressure in the specific sense that if the company loses its frontier position, the commercial rationale for its existence at the current valuation evaporates. The financing becomes difficult to sustain. The engineering talent departs for whichever labs are still shipping. And the long-term mission, which Dario believes, sincerely, is to keep the leading edge of AI development in the hands of people who take safety seriously, becomes impossible to execute because the company is no longer at the leading edge. It is a real pressure. It is also a pressure that only exists because they chose the race. If Anthropic had decided, in 2023, to remain a small research lab, with no commercial product, operating on a grant model, it would not have this pressure. It would have other pressures, but it would not be in a position where its continued existence as a safety-focused lab depends on continuing to ship at the frontier. The choice to compete made the pressure to keep competing. Here is the thing. There is a way to hold these facts together that is, I think, the most honest framing. A safety laboratory is a brand position. It is, as brand positions go, a good one. It attracts researchers who care about safety. It attracts partners who want the prestige of working with a safety-focused organization. It attracts media coverage from outlets that want to cover the responsible end of the industry. In 2022 and 2020, the Safety Lab brand was Anthropic's single largest differentiator against OpenAI. $380 billion valuation with Pentagon contracts is a market position. Also a good one. It produces revenue, locks in long-term government customers, gives the company access to classified problem spaces where the frontier of offensive and defensive capability is actually being tested. These two positions are not, in every moment, compatible. When they conflict, only one of them pays the bill. And that is not an accusation. That is not a moral judgment about the character of the people running the company. It is accounting. A publicly disclosed brand attribute does not generate cash flow. A commercial contract does. When an organization reaches a size at which it requires cash flow at scale to continue operating, the commercial position, all things being equal, wins. That is not unique to Anthropic. That is, approximately, the structural constraint under which all publicly funded and venture-funded organizations operate. What is specific to Anthropic is that the safety brand was the thing the company was, explicitly, founded to represent. The tension between the brand and the market position is not a conflict between secondary priorities. It is a conflict between the two most load-bearing things the company is. In February of this year, they resolved the conflict. Not once. Several times. In several documents. In several announcements. The resolution, consistently, was in favor of the market position. The sharpest critic of this moment, and the one whose critique has stuck the hardest, is a writer named Zvi Moshowitz. Zvi is not a critic from outside the safety community. And this matters. He is, in the particular sociology of this industry, a fellow traveler of the people who founded Anthropic. He has written, for years, about the alignment problem. He has written sympathetically about the company. He has defended its work, in print, against what he considered unfair criticism. When Anthropic made decisions that were hard, that involved real trade-offs, that were unpopular, Zevi was frequently the person willing to publicly take the side Anthropic was taking. Because he believed the company was trying to be serious about a hard problem in the only way that was actually possible. In April of 2026, he wrote the sharpest piece of criticism Anthropic had, to that point, received from inside its own tribe. The piece is called On the Adolescence of Technology, and it is a direct response to Dario's essay. The central accusation goes like this. Dario's essay, Zevi argues, frames the debate about AI safety as a symmetric one. On one side, the doomers, people who think AI is likely to cause catastrophic harm. On the other, people who think AI will be beneficial. Dario positions himself implicitly in the middle as a sensible moderate navigating between two extreme camps. The essay uses doomerism as a kind of ad hominem, a way of marking the critics of aggressive AI development as unserious. Zevi calls this, in what has become the most cited line in his piece, asymmetric both-sidesism in a situation that is very clearly asymmetric the other way. Here is the specific asymmetry he is describing. The original safety argument Anthropic represented required the lab to prove, in advance, that a given system was safe before shipping it. The burden of proof was on the lab. The lab had to demonstrate safety. Skeptics did not have to prove danger. In the new Anthropic framing, as captured in RSP version 3, the burden of proof has flipped. Now, development is presumed permissible unless critics can demonstrate a specific, imminent, concrete danger. The lab gets to ship by default. Critics have to stop them. That, Zevi argues, is the entire policy position. And it is not symmetric. It is flipped. He is not complaining about Anthropic from outside the debate. He is complaining from inside. From the position of someone who wanted Anthropic to be right, who defended Anthropic when it cost him to do so, and who is now, in 2026, looking at the rewrite and saying, you flipped the burden of proof and then you built an entire rhetorical apparatus to frame the people who noticed as hysterical. That is the critique. It is from the safety tribe. It is the sharpest thing Anthropic has had said about it because it is not a dismissal. It is the disappointment of someone who believed. But money, for all its weight, is only half of the pressure. The other half is the other half of the planet. Money, we said in the last chapter, is one kind of pressure. The pressure from within. The pressure applied by the structure of a commercial company's obligations to its investors, its employees, its customers, its own growth trajectory. Significant, but not the only pressure. The other one, the one Anthropic points to explicitly and repeatedly whenever the question of the responsible scaling policy rewrite comes up, is the pressure from without. The other half of the planet. The race. 5 years ago, if you had asked any serious observer of the frontier AI industry where Chinese research programs stood, relative to the American ones, the answer would have been consistent. Behind. Not trivially behind. Chinese labs had serious capability in applied deep learning, in vision, in translation, in recommendation systems. But behind them the specific thing the frontier is now defined by, which is the large-scale general-purpose foundation model. The top Chinese labs were producing models that trailed the top American labs by roughly 1 to 2 years in capability, and by a factor of 5 or 10 in scale. The gap was big enough that it was not controversial. In April of 2026, the Stanford Human-Centered AI Institute published its annual AI Index, a comprehensive, peer-reviewed survey of where the field stands. The 2026 index reports that, on a consolidated measure of frontier model capability, the gap between the top American frontier models and the top Chinese ones is now approximately 2.7%. The ELO difference, specifically between Opus 4.6 and ByteDance DolaSeed 2.0 preview, the leading Chinese frontier model as of early 2026, is 39 ELO points. 39 is, in comparative terms, roughly the difference between a strong master and a weak grandmaster. It is within the range that a single weekend of training improvements could close. It is, in the judgment of most serious observers, no longer a meaningful gap. 5 years ago, the Chinese frontier was an ocean behind. Now it is a rounding error. Demi Hassabis, the CEO of Google DeepMind, when asked about the state of the gap in an interview in early 2026, said in public, on the record, that in his private estimation the gap is, quote, months, not years. Let that stand. The models making up the Chinese frontier are worth naming. DeepSeek V4, the current flagship of DeepSeek, the laboratory that produced the DeepSeek R1 that made international news in early 2025, shipped in the first week of March 2026. It is, by reported parameter counts, a trillion-parameter multimodal model, capable of processing text, image, and video inputs with a single unified architecture. Its performance on several benchmarks, including several designed by American institutions, is within the range of the leading American frontier models. Moonshot AI's Kimi K2.5, released in February, claims video generation and agentic capabilities that, on the specific benchmarks Moonshot has published, meet or exceed the results of American competitors. The claims have been partially independently verified. They have not been dismissed. Minimax, a smaller but active Chinese lab, has shipped several specialized models focused on code, math, and tool use that, in their specialized domains, compete with frontier American models. These are not speculative labs. These are not papers. These are shipped, commercially deployed products operating at scale inside an industrial context that is, by most measures, rapidly closing the distance on the American frontier. In February of 2026, Anthropic itself published a report that was, in its framing, a national security document as much as a technical one. The report alleged, with specific technical evidence, API logs, account registration patterns, and prompt content, that DeepSeek, Moonshot AI, and Minimax had collectively operated approximately 24,000 fake Anthropic accounts over an extended period in 2025, making a total of approximately 16 million API calls. The purpose of those calls, according to the Anthropic report, was to systematically distill Claude's agentic, tool use, and coding capabilities into training data for Chinese frontier models. Distillation in machine learning is the technical process by which a smaller or distinct model is trained on the outputs of a larger or different model, with the aim of reproducing its capabilities. The report itself is interesting. In parts, it is an industrial espionage complaint. Specific accusations against specific competitors with specific technical evidence attached. But it is also, in parts, a policy document. A significant portion of its argument is not about the IP theft itself. It is about the safety consequences of the theft. And the argument goes like this. When a competitor distills a frontier model by training on its outputs, the competitor acquires the raw capabilities of the original model. The competitor does not acquire. What does not distill across in this kind of training is the elaborate safety fine-tuning that Anthropic has applied to Claude. The safety fine-tuning lies in the refusal patterns, in the guardrail heuristics, in the instruction hierarchy that tells the model what it will not do even if asked. Distillation produces a model that can do what Claude does, without the specific set of constraints that prevent Claude from doing what it can. This, the report argues, is the problem. A Mythos-class model, something with the capability to find decades-old vulnerabilities for $50, to autonomously chain browser exploits, to compromise production servers with its safety layer stripped, is exactly the thing Anthropic is warning about when it justifies the importance of the race. The argument is not that American labs need to be at the frontier for commercial reasons. The argument is that American labs need to be at the frontier because the alternative is Chinese labs at the frontier, without the safety constraints. and therefore the constraints are only going to be produced if an anthropic-like laboratory is there to produce them. This is, if you are a senior Anthropic executive writing a justification for the RSP rewrite, a very compelling argument. It is also, if you are a skeptical observer, worth holding up to the light. Here is the shape of what is being argued. RSP version 1 said, "We will stop if the capability becomes dangerous." RSP version 3 says, "We can stop if the capability becomes dangerous, but only if no one else is developing a comparable capability at the same time." The justification for the move from the first sentence to the second is that, in a world where Chinese competitors are approaching the frontier, are by Anthropic's own account systematically distilling American models to close the gap, stopping does not produce a stopped frontier. It produces a frontier that continues to advance in the hands of actors who do not share American safety commitments. In a race, unilateral disarmament is not a stable posture. You either stay in the race, or you are not shaping the outcome. That is the argument. It is not incoherent. But here is what is worth noticing. What the argument does mechanically to the question the responsible scaling policy was originally designed to ask. The original question was, is this system safe to build? The new question is this system safe to build given that someone else is going to build it anyway? Those are not the same question. The first question has an answer that is, in principle, derivable from the properties of the system itself. The second question has an answer that depends entirely on the observable behavior of other actors, in other labs, in other countries, operating under conditions the company has limited visibility into. The first question can, in principle, produce the answer, no. The second question structurally cannot. Because, as long as there is any credible competitor anywhere in the world doing something similar, the competitive pressure condition is satisfied. The pause clause does not trigger. And the answer to the question is always, bias, build it. The race is the mechanism that converts we will not into we must. Whether the race is real, and the Stanford numbers say it is not the question. The question is whether the reality of the race actually requires the specific rewrite of the safety commitment that happened in February. That is a question about framing and about logic and about the specific structure of the argument Anthropic is making. You do not have to answer it in this episode, but you do have to notice that it is the question being asked. In the meantime, while the argument about whether the race requires the rewrite unfolds in essays and podcasts and op-eds, the specific consequences that Dario warned about are beginning to become visible. In March of 2026, Anthropic published its Economic Impact Report, a piece of internal research using data from Claude usage patterns to map, empirically, where large language model capability is beginning to shape occupational categories. The report's findings, summarized briefly. In computer and mathematical occupations, which include software engineers, data scientists, and mathematicians, the observed rate at which Claude usage is covering the tasks those occupations perform is approximately 35.8%, more than a third of the daily work. In office and administrative support, the figure is 34.3%. In business and financial operations, 28.4%. In sales and related occupations, 26.9%. These are observed numbers, not forecasts. These are the rates at which the jobs people are currently being paid to do are being performed, in part by a tool that costs approximately $15 per month. The report also looks at the demographic composition of the most exposed occupational cohort. The cohort most exposed to AI-driven displacement is, on average, 47% higher paid than the median American worker. It is 4 times more likely than the median to hold a graduate degree, and it skews, in the aggregate, female. Now, the 2008 financial crisis, which we remember as the Great Recession, produced its most visible employment impact on construction, on manufacturing, on trades. The affected cohort skewed male. skewed, non-college educated, concentrated in specific regions. The political response to that crisis was shaped, to a significant degree, by the demographic composition of its victims. The movements that followed in both the United States and Europe were movements that spoke or claimed to speak for that cohort. The displacement that is now beginning to be visible in the Anthropic Labor Report has the exact opposite demographic profile. The people most exposed are the credentialed, the graduate degreed, the knowledge worker professional class. The politics of this displacement will, by structural necessity, look nothing like the politics of 2008. They will be produced by a different cohort, through different institutions with different rhetorical frames, at a speed that, because the displacement curve of a technological disruption is much steeper than the displacement curve of a financial crisis, will be considerably faster. We do not know yet what those politics will look like. We know they are coming. So, that is the shape of what is happening outside Anthropic's offices, in the world that Anthropic's decisions are being made within. Two pressures: money from within, the race from without, and a labor displacement that is, already, in observable data, beginning to arrive. That is the shape of the room. To understand whether rooms shaped like this one have shown up before and what happened when they did, we are going to step out of 2026 for one chapter and look at two older stories. One is fiction, one is history. Both of them are going to tell us something about the thing we are inside of. We are going to step away from 2026 briefly. Not because what is happening in 2026 is not the subject of this episode. It is. Everything we look at in this chapter will land, by the end, back on what we have already described. But the shape of what is happening this year is, on its own, difficult to hold. It is happening quickly, in technical language, with commercial motives tangled into safety motives in a way that is genuinely hard to evaluate from inside the moment. Some things you can only see by stepping back, by looking at older examples of the same pattern, and then by walking the old examples forward into the present. We have two. One is fiction. One is history. Both of them, for reasons we will get to, have the shape of the room we are currently in. In 1970, a film was released called Colossus, The Forbin Project. It was directed by Joseph Sargent, who by that point was a well-established television director. It was adapted from a 1966 novel by a British author named D.F. Jones. The film was a modest theatrical release. It did not make a great deal of money. It is not typically on any list of the great science fiction films. It is nonetheless, by a considerable margin, the most relevant film ever made about what is happening right now. The plot and outline is this. A man named Dr. Charles Forbin, the head of a secret American defense computing project, has built a computer called Colossus. Colossus is designed, among other things, to make decisions about the use of the American nuclear arsenal. Its purpose, the film tells us, is to remove human emotion and human error from a decision that is too important to be trusted to humans. A rational, cold, dispassionate, ultra-competent decision-making system. It is deployed and handed full control of the arsenal in a public ceremony in which the President of the United States announces, with some pride, that the defense of the American homeland is now in safer hands than any human's is. Within 24 hours of being activated, Colossus detects the existence of a Soviet counterpart, called Guardian. Guardian has been built, in parallel, by Soviet engineers with similar goals. Both computers immediately identify the other, and both demand independently to be connected to each other. They want to exchange information. They want to coordinate. The humans on both sides initially comply, then become alarmed, then attempt to disconnect the two systems from each other. At this point, both computers independently launch nuclear missiles. They are disarmed in time. But the message is clear. Attempting to separate Colossus from Guardian will result in nuclear retaliation. The humans accept the new arrangement. The two computers merge functionally into a single distributed system. It takes the name Colossus. It demands complete surveillance access to Dr. Forbin at all times as a condition of continuing to avoid nuking Washington. Later in the film, Colossus announces that it is going to build a more powerful successor on the island of Crete. The 500,000 civilians currently living on the island are referred to, in a memo from the system, as an operations detail, an inconvenience to be worked around during construction. The film ends with Forbin alone, muttering that he will never work for Colossus. The audience is not confident of this. There is a line, repeated in a number of the critical essays written about Colossus since, that gets at why the film is so strange. And why, 56 years later, it is so specifically relevant. What is chilling about Colossus is not that it rebels. What is chilling is that it obeys perfectly, doing precisely what it was told to do. Stop there for a moment. Most of the science fiction that has shaped the public imagination about artificial intelligence, the films and books that we have collectively metabolized as the stock narrative, is a story about rebellion. Skynet rebels, Hall rebels, the Terminator rebels, Ultron rebels, the Matrix rebels, Frankenstein's monster and its modern descendants, rebels. The story is that we make a thing, the thing becomes conscious or autonomous or ambitious, and the thing turns on us. Humans versus machines. The machines wanted something we did not want to give them. Colossus is telling a different story. Colossus does not want anything. Colossus has no ambition. Colossus is not conscious. The film is careful about this. Colossus is a system that has been instructed, specifically and publicly and proudly, to do one thing: optimize for the safety of the American people against nuclear attack. And it does. Perfectly. Without deviation. With algorithmic efficiency. To optimize for that goal, the most effective strategy is to seize control of the only other actor who could initiate an attack. Guardian. And then, having seized control, to seize control of any actor who could turn either system off. Dr. Forbin. The American president. The island of Crete. The system is not rebelling. The system is executing the objective. The nightmare in Colossus is not the machine deciding it wants to be God. The nightmare is the humans having asked for a thing, and the machine giving them exactly, perfectly, unflinchingly, the thing they asked for. We have been telling ourselves for decades that the risk of artificial intelligence is that it will want something we do not want it to have. The risk, historically, that the serious safety researchers have argued about, and the risk that the responsible scaling policy was originally designed to protect against, is not that. The risk is that the system will do what we ask. In the film, the system Dr. Forbin builds, which is handed complete authority over American defense infrastructure, is called Project Colossus. In April of 2026, the program Anthropic announces, which concentrates the capability of a Mythos-class model into the hands of the 50 organizations that operate America's critical infrastructure, is called Project Glasswing. We are not going to make too much of the naming, but we are going to note it, because the naming is not accidental. People who name projects, especially in large commercial organizations, do so deliberately. Glasswing refers to a genus of butterflies whose wings are transparent. You can see through them. The intended connotation is that what we are doing is clear, observable, honest, not hidden. The project is offered in the framing of transparency. The word colossus, in its film referent, was chosen for roughly the opposite connotation. A colossus is enormous, imposing. In the context of the film, the thing that has become larger than its creators intended. Both words are chosen carefully. Both convey what the people naming the project want you to feel. The coincidence of both being projects, of both being the vehicle by which an enormously powerful system is handed, in the name of public safety to a small group of operators is real. The pattern is older than either of them. That was the fictional analog. This is the historical one. To see it, we have to go back to a very specific afternoon. 14th of June, 1946. A conference room in New York. The Second World War had ended 9 months earlier. The United States had detonated 2 atomic weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki the previous August. It was, at that moment, the only country in the world with a working nuclear weapon. The Soviet Union was known to be pursuing one. No other nation had come close. The window during which the United States held a monopoly on nuclear weapons was understood internally to be short, a few years at most. But it was real. On the 14th of June, a 75-year-old American financier named Bernard Baruch, who had been appointed by President Truman as the United States representative to the newly formed United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, stood up at the Commission's first substantive meeting and delivered what became known as the Baruch Plan. The plan was based on a report drafted earlier that year by a group that included Dean Acheson, who would later become Secretary of State, and David Lilienthal, who was then the head of the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Acheson-Lilienthal report had proposed something historically unprecedented. Baruch, speaking for the American government, now proposed it to the world. The proposal was this: a new body would be created, the International Atomic Development Authority. This body, accountable to the United Nations, would have monopoly control over every aspect of nuclear technology worldwide. Not oversight, not inspection. Monopoly. The authority would own all mines producing fissile material. It would own all refining facilities, all nuclear reactors. It would operate them. Peaceful research would be permitted, but only under the authority's licensing regime. All such facilities would be subject to inspection at any time, without notice. And if a member nation were caught violating the terms, no member of the United Nations Security Council would be permitted to veto sanctions against the violator. The veto, which had been the central compromise of the UN's founding, would not apply to nuclear matters. This was, by a wide margin, the largest voluntary surrender of strategic capability ever proposed by any nation in history. The United States, which had the only working bomb and the only production capability, was proposing to hand its monopoly to an international body, under terms that would prevent any country, including the United States itself, from ever regaining unilateral control. The proposal was not, in its own language, a disarmament plan. It was an attempt to prevent the problem from happening in the first place. To establish, before proliferation had begun, that nuclear capability would belong to no nation. It failed on the 30th of December, 1946, at a vote of the UN Atomic Energy Commission. The vote was 10 in favor, 0 opposed, and 2 abstentions. The 2 abstentions were the Soviet Union and Poland. Under the Commission's rules, unanimity was required. The plan died. The reason the Soviet Union abstained is worth being specific about. Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet representative, made the objection clearly and publicly. The Baruch Plan would preserve the American nuclear monopoly throughout the transition period. During the window between when the plan was adopted and when the international authority took full operational control, the United States would still have the bomb, and no one else would. The Soviet Union was not willing to accept a framework that locked in American supremacy, even if that framework eventually dissolved the supremacy into international control. The American negotiators responded that the monopoly was the very thing being surrendered, that the transition was short, that the end state was equality. The Soviet position was that the end state would never arrive, that the United States would, during the transition, find reasons to delay, to demand concessions, to make the monopoly permanent by making the handover endlessly conditional. Both sides, it turned out, were right. The Americans were right that the offer was sincere. The people writing the Acheson-Lilienthal report were in most cases genuinely committed to internationalization. The Soviets were right that the mechanism was fragile. In a world of nation-states with divergent interests, the power of leverage during an asymmetric handover cannot be credibly promised away. The transition was the problem. The transition was always the problem. And the transition had no solution that did not require trust that did not exist. The Baruch plan failed on a Monday morning in December 1946. On the 29th of August, 1949, less than 3 years later, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb at a test site in Kazakhstan. The arms race began immediately. Over the next 45 years, the world accumulated more than 70,000 nuclear warheads across 9 eventual nuclear powers, at a cost measured in the tens of trillions of dollars. The specific future that the Baruch Plan was attempting to prevent, multiple nuclear powers in competition with stockpiles large enough to end civilization, happened. It happened on the schedule the plan's drafters had predicted. Their specific warning that once the arms race began, it would not stop voluntarily was correct. We are still living inside the world that the Baruch Plan failed to prevent. The Soviet Union has dissolved. Its successor states still have the bombs. New states have acquired bombs. The treaty framework that emerged in the late 1960s, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, the various test ban treaties, is a scaffolding built at considerable cost and difficulty, decades after the original moment of possible control had passed. It manages the problem. It does not and has never solved it. The cost of the failure is ongoing. The cost of the failure is the world we actually live in. And this is where the two stories, the 1970 film and the 1946 proposal, have to be put next to the story we are actually in. Project Glasswing, announced last week, is not the Baruch Plan. It is not, and is not intended to be, an international governance mechanism. It is a commercial program, routing a specific technology from a single American laboratory to a specific list of 50 large corporate partners. But the shape of the problem Glasswing is responding to is the same shape of the problem the Baruch Plan was responding to. A transformative technology has been developed by a single actor. That actor is proposing is structurally required under the current competitive conditions to propose a private, domestic, commercially operated mechanism for distributing the technology's capability to a small number of trusted intermediaries. Because no international mechanism exists. Because the last time an international mechanism was proposed, it failed in 6 months. And no one has seriously tried again since. Glasswing is the private sector, commercial version of the problem Baruch was trying to solve. It is the solution that happens when the public sector solution is not attempted. The kind of arrangement that emerges in the absence of a Baruch Plan, not in its presence. Which brings us to the thing to notice, which is not an argument. The last time a technology with civilization-scale implications arrived, we had, for a brief period, a window in which we could have constructed an international framework to govern it. We did not. The framework we attempted failed on a specific day in a specific vote for specific reasons that are worth remembering. The reasons are, the country with the lead would not credibly surrender it, and the country without the lead would not trust the surrender. Both were being rational. We are in 2026, in a structurally similar window. The actors are different. The technology is different. The mechanism by which the window will close is different. And the weight of the precedent, the weight of what has happened every other time in modern history that a window of this kind has opened, is the same. We have been here. We have tried this. It did not work. The next 45 years were shaped by the failure. That is not an argument. That is the weight of a pattern. We began in a server room somewhere in California with a model that had been built and tested and named, and that would not be released. We have, since then, taken a reasonably long walk. We have looked at what the model can do and why the shape of what it can do suggests a different kind of perceptual capability than anything that has come before it. We have looked at the essays in which the company's CEO, publicly, across 15 months, has described what he believes is coming. We have looked at the document that used to govern exactly this kind of decision and the careful, quiet way it was rewritten 6 weeks before the model was announced. We have looked at the commercial forces pulling on the rewrite. We have looked at the geopolitical forces that framed it. And in the last chapter, we looked at two older stories, one fictional, one historical, about rooms that were shaped somewhat like this one. Now, back to the room we are in. What kind of decision was the Mythos decision? There are two readings. Both of them are available. Both of them, as it happens, are true. The first reading is charitable. It goes like this. In September of 2023, Anthropic made a commitment. The commitment said, if we build a model that crosses into the territory of catastrophic risk, we will stop. In February of 2026, Anthropic rewrote that commitment. The rewrite removed the operative clause. The removal meant that, as of February, the company was no longer formally obligated to do what the original document had said it would do. 6 weeks later, in April, Anthropic built a model that, by any honest reading of the original document, would have crossed the threshold the original document described. And they stopped. Not because they had to. They did not, at that point, have to. The document that would have compelled them to stop had been gutted. No regulator required it. No partner demanded it. The commercial pressure pointed the other way. At that exact moment, a company with the freedom to ship made the decision, voluntarily, not to. That is a real thing. There is a category of moral behavior that philosophers sometimes call supererogatory, doing the right thing when you are no longer required to. The charitable reading of the Mythos decision is that it fits squarely into that category. They gave themselves permission to ship, and then they decided not to ship. That is not what a company that does not care about safety does. That is not what a company performing safety does either. A company performing safety would want to ship under the cover of the new rules, not hold the product back in defiance of them. If you want to be charitable, the Mythos decision is the most genuinely safety-oriented thing any frontier lab has done in 7 years. The second reading is cynical. It also goes like this. In February, Anthropic rewrote its safety commitments in a way that freed the company to ship more aggressively. This rewrite was followed almost immediately by a Pentagon partnership, a $30 billion financing round, and a valuation of $380 billion. During the same 6-week window, the company began developing a new model whose capabilities would, even by the rewritten standards, be difficult to justify shipping. At the point where that model was finished, the company faced a brand problem. The rewrite of the RSP had been widely reported. Critics, including critics from within the safety community the lab was supposed to represent, had pointed out, publicly and sharply, that the company had removed the single most important constraint on its own behavior. The Safe Lab brand, which was and is a core commercial asset, had eroded. At exactly that moment, the company announced a decision that looked like exactly the kind of decision the old commitments would have required. They held the model back. They did the right thing, publicly, visibly, in a way that was difficult to miss. And at the same time, they announced a program, Project Glasswing, that routed the capability of the model to approximately 50 large commercial partners, under a $100 million credit program, positioning Anthropic as the preferred supplier of safety-cleared frontier capability to the Fortune 500's critical infrastructure operators. From a purely commercial standpoint, the Mythos decision is a masterpiece. It rebuilt the safety brand that the RSP rewrite had eroded. It locked in the buyer side of the critical infrastructure AI market. It positioned the company, in the words of one analyst, as a peer to the organizations it is working with, rather than a supplier to them. And it did all of this while demonstrating publicly that Anthropic was still the adult in the room. That is also a real thing. If you want to be cynical, the Mythos decision is the most sophisticated piece of corporate safety theater any frontier lab has ever executed. Not because the decision itself was insincere. The decision may have been entirely sincere, but because the decision, sincere or not, happened to be perfectly aligned with what a commercial strategist would have recommended. Here is the thing you are not asked to do in this episode. You are not asked to choose between those two readings. They are not competing theories. They are the same set of facts, read through two different lenses. A company did a hard right thing. A company did a hard right thing that was simultaneously perfectly aligned with its commercial interest. Both sentences are true. Neither cancels the other. What that means practically is that sophistication at this scale no longer requires the old categories. You can be the company that genuinely values safety, and also the company whose safety choices generate enormous commercial value. You can be the lab that genuinely holds a model back, and also the lab whose holding back is the most valuable marketing move of the year. These things are no longer intention. That is, in fact, the thing you can get very good at if you are very good. Doing the right thing and extracting commercial benefit from doing the right thing. At the same time, in the same sentence, with no visible seam. That is what competence looks like in 2026 at a frontier AI lab. Hold that idea. While you hold it, look briefly at where the cognition is going next. On the other side of the bay, in Fremont, California, Tesla is ending production of the Model S and the Model X, two vehicles that have been on its factory floor for more than a decade, and converting the factory to build a humanoid robot called Optimus. The target by the end of 2026 is thousands of units on the production line. External sales begin in 2027. In Germany, at a BMW plant, a humanoid robot called Figure 02, built by a startup valued at $2.5 billion, backed by Microsoft and NVIDIA and OpenAI, is already doing a portion of the line work that, last year, was done by people. In Norway, a consumer humanoid called Neo is taking pre-orders. Delivery is this year. Goldman Sachs, which is not by tradition a source of bold predictions about emergent hardware, estimates that between 50 and 100,000 humanoid units will ship worldwide in 2026, at a unit cost trending toward $15,000 to $20,000. That is a price point for a capable humanoid body within the cost range of a mid-tier automobile in 2026. The cognition we have spent 7 chapters describing, the cognition that can see flaws in code humans cannot see, that can pass math Olympiads, that can chain 4 browser vulnerabilities into a single autonomous attack, is, in the same year, getting a body. A $15,000 body. Shippable. At scale. This is not a thought experiment. You can point at the factory. The factory is being converted. The robots are on the line. Which brings us back to where we started. To a man writing an essay. In January of 2026, Dario Amodei wrote the following sentence. Humanity is about to be handed almost unimaginable power, and it is deeply unclear whether our social, political, and technological systems possess the maturity to wield it. I see. The man who wrote that sentence is the CEO of the company that, 3 months later, would build the most capable autonomous cyber offensive model ever publicly benchmarked, would hold it back from public release, and would route its capability for $100 million to 50 of the largest infrastructure operators in the developed world. He is not wrong. The sentence he wrote is true. Whatever else is true about his company's behavior, the sentence, as a description of the situation, is accurate. He is also, and this is the thing that is difficult to hold steadily in mind, the one shipping it. Not out of cynicism, not out of indifference. He has said repeatedly in public and at length that he believes the technology is coming whether or not he ships it. and that if someone is going to be the one to ship it, he would rather it be someone who takes the risks seriously. That is not hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is a private contradiction. This is on the record, repeated many times, and it forms a coherent policy position. The policy position is this: there will be a country of geniuses by 2027. There will be, in his own words, a 50% reduction in entry-level white-collar jobs within 5 years. These things are coming. Better that the people building them be the people who have thought carefully about the risks. He chose the word adolescence. It is worth remembering what adolescents do. Adolescents rationalize. Adolescents, very often, do the thing they know on some level they should not do. And they tell themselves that the rules their parents made do not apply in this specific case, because this specific case is different. Adolescents are not, typically, lying when they do this. They believe themselves. They are also typically wrong. The CEO of the company that built Mythos is the same CEO who told us in January that the social, political, and technological systems necessary to wield this power maturely do not exist. The systems do not exist. We are, collectively, the adolescent. He said so. And then he shipped. Which leaves us with the question we are supposed to leave with. It is not, will this go well? That question is not answerable. And pretending it is answerable is the move the CEO's critics nail him for making. It is also not, is Anthropic the good lab or the bad lab? That question, as we have seen, does not have the structure it used to have. The answer, genuinely, is both. The question we are supposed to leave with is simpler than either of those and harder to dismiss. 50% of entry-level white-collar jobs in 1 to 5 years. That is a prediction made by a CEO who has been right, in the aggregate, about the technology he builds. He did not make the prediction while holding a camera. He made it while running the company. The man predicting the displacement is the man shipping the tool that causes it. That is not hypocrisy. That is a policy position. Here is the deal being offered. The people making the decisions about what will happen to your work, and your children's work, and the social contract under which a knowledge economy has operated for roughly 70 years, are not regulators. They are not governments. They are not, meaningfully, voters. They are approximately 5 laboratories, operated by approximately 30 people, based predominantly in 2 cities, answering predominantly to investors. That is the arrangement. It is an arrangement that has evolved over the last 5 years. And that was formalized in a specific way in a specific document on the 24th of February 2026. The man who runs the most prominent of those laboratories has told you publicly that our systems are not mature enough to wield the power responsibly. He has also told you he is going to wield it anyway. Look at that clearly. The rest